So Rachel,
Okay.
thanks. I'll hand it over to you, and thanks for leading us through this journal club this month.
No problem. So good afternoon. This is Journal Club for September 2020, and today we're going to look at, well, I've critically appraised a paper which was produced by the Danish Air Ambulance. And they have basically looked at some data from 2014 to 2018 from their HEMS database of patients that have been triaged, and either they have conveyed those patients to hospital, they've ground escorted those patients, they've assisted those patients, or they have been cancelled en route to those jobs, and they've, within that criteria, they've looked at the outcomes for those patients and the characteristics of those patients. So by characteristics, what's meant is like age and sex and comorbidities, and outcomes. They've looked at whether they their sort of survival rates over a year. So they've looked at day 1, day 30, and 1 year, and also whether or not those patients were admitted to ITU or were mechanically ventilated. So this is the paper.
Just to interject just for a second,
Yeah.
it's just so that sort of people know why we chose this paper.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I think, it was an interesting paper, and also in terms of asking Rachel to lead the critical appraisal and have one of our paramedics do it, was there's been a lot of discussion amongst the paramedics on our team right now about how to evaluate our dispatching and decision making and stuff. And I thought this was just a really good paper that looks at the type of data we need to start to think about how we could do that in our service. And I think, we'll highlight some of the things, but having sort of outcome-based, patient-based results to help inform that, it's a nice example that we can look at. So thanks for taking us through it. I'll let you continue on.
No worries. So just before we sort of get into the critical appraisal, I thought it would be good to just do a bit of explanation of the Danish Air Ambulance and Denmark as a whole. So their air ambulance service officially started in 2014. They did have some regional air ambulances before, but across the whole 5 regions, they've now got these 4 air ambulances. And they operate 24 hours a day, and they can fly to all parts. And it's an interesting geography that they've got, and a very small population, but challenging in a sense that they've got lots of islands, people who are difficult to access, and a variety of terrain. But if you think in sort of population versus us in London, it's very, very small. And the way their health service works, they've got a free health service, and I suppose there's not so much these speciality hospitals. They've got either the university hospital that's got pretty much everything, or the district general hospitals. And their dispatch is a little bit different to ours in a sense that they have a variety of professionals doing their dispatch. They've got a national criteria, so it's a good standard there. And there's 5 bases that they will use to take the 112 calls and triage them and decide whether or not to send the HEMS team. And they're very similar in their structure for the ambulances. So they've got paramedics and EMTs on the main ambulances, and then they do also have critical care teams available in those areas. The HEMS dispatch protocol is very similar in terms of critical care. They're looking at major trauma, stroke, MIs, cardiac arrest, and I think that a lot of their work is also into hospital transfers for sort of minor things on these 70 small islands. So that also creates a lot of work for them. And just to talk you through what we are doing. So this is a the CAS system to do this systematic assessment of published papers, and we're just asking these sort of broad questions initially, and the appraisal is broken down into 12 questions, and they cover these areas. So initially looking at whether this is a good study, you know, can we rely on the data that they've put in it, and what does it tell us, and what can we learn from it, and what can we potentially do in the future. So so the first question I looked at was this a clearly focused study? And they've explained it very well what their cohort is. They're a bit lazy initially with their description of saying this was a national population-based study, and actually it's quite focused. This is a focused cohort of patients that have called, or patients who are in the HEMS database that they have, and these people who have through a 112 call have had the HEMS team dispatched, and the aircraft has lifted. So they've clarified that and who these patients are in this study, and the outcomes they've clarified, and used validated databases, the Danish national registers, and they've identified specific outcomes. And the cohort is quite specific, so it is missions with takeoff. And I think myself and Mike were talking about this. It's quite a sort of I thought it was quite strange that they said this, missions with takeoff, because they've effectively excluded patients where the team were cancelled before the aircraft lifted, and but the criteria that they've used and the database they've used is acceptable. So it was just understanding and clarifying that. And to group these patients, they've specified them in these four groups. So to give you a little chance to read those, but airlifted patients, ground escorted patients, assisted patients is all terms that we're very familiar with. The aborted missions, and specifically they have been seen by a clinician in the pre-hospital environment, but the HEMS team were cancelled whilst en route to them, and specifically when the aircraft is lifted. And rejected missions are basically all those that are cancelled, so they're basically excluded from this cohort study.
And I guess, Rachel, just if you go back to that last slide just for a second, the one thing that we had talked about is that when we think about this from a perspective, other than London perspective, you know, for us, the rejected missions, that would be, you know, we have an average target of 4 minutes for takeoff, but in a lot of county and also international air ambulance services, their launch time is often up to 20 minutes as their target. So that could actually be a much larger cohort of patients. And it was kind of interesting that they chose that. And I think, as we had discussed, I think it may be more related to how their database is structured rather than any sort of clinical thing. It's just a little odd to say that, because those patients could be, you know, not all that different from the ones that were the aborted missions, where they were already seen by somebody and then canceled. So it was just a little puzzling. But I don't know if anybody else had any other thoughts on that. Feel free to chime in. But yeah, it's just sort of something to keep in the back of our mind. But at least it seems that they've consistently applied this, and they're very clear about their cohort.
Okay, so these are two questions, but I put them together because I think one was not particularly relevant. So was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias, and was the outcome accurately measured to minimize bias? So in terms of exposure, I guess I suppose this is not a sort of pharmaceutical trial or that kind of study. So exposure, I don't know, do we say that it was like exposure to the HEMS team is effectively what happened to patients?
This type of
yeah,
observational study, it would be you can think about this as an observational cohort is usually something like, did people smoke or not smoke, or did they, that would be the exposure. In this case, it would be the HEMS team or non-HEMS team kind of thing would be the sort of exposure they were looking at, with different doses of canceled en route, arrive and assist, or escorted versus carry back being the full dose HEMS.
So, and it's not necessarily clear from sort of based on that, it's not necessarily clear in terms of what they did for those patients on scene. So, that's quite difficult for us to sort of clarify. An outcome is really great in this paper. So they've used mortality rates from the Danish National Register. They have got a really sort of, since this the start of their system in 2014, they've got this HEMS database, which is giving them all this information, or they're registering all this information, and thankfully Danish people all seem to have unique identifiers and in their system, so they're able to identify these patients and follow up, and that's the real strength of this paper as well, is that there's a lot of follow up. And in terms of accuracy, I feel like we can rely on this as well, in terms of we've got a lot of statistics and validated sources, and we can sort of presume the happy Danes, who are a very a wealthy, healthy country, are able to are giving us sort of reliable data, and hopefully not losing too many people in this process, and excluding that information. So in terms of confounding factors, they have taken this into account, and it's there's quite a large group of patients, and specifically in the mission aborted group, and these are the patients that sort of have left a sort of big question mark. So they don't have the unique identifier in the system, so they are not able to be followed up. So there's a whole sort of around about 12% of the sort of initial database that we can't find out any information for, and they've identified it as a problem potentially, or it might distort the figures, but there's very little I think they could do about it. I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts on those patients and what they could have done, or what they could do maybe to change their database, or how they follow these up. And in terms of follow up, it's really fantastic. I thought it was that they've got this day 1, day 30, and day and 1 year, follow up for these patients. So it's really impressive that they've been able to get this information. I think something that would be hugely beneficial for us in the future. And so we can have a look at the results. I'm sorry, this screenshot hasn't come out very well. So in terms of the different results that we've got, just to sort of summarize some of the findings. So in terms of demographics, it's definitely a sort of a heavy male population that they're seeing. And they identified that there were sort of 2/3, I think, of the patients in terms of didn't have comorbidities listed, and they sort of implied that maybe these are patients that have not been through the hospital system and have just been treated in the community, and that information is not available. So that could sort of skew these figures a little bit as well. Sorry. Okay. And this is probably one of the more interesting results. And in terms of these sets of patients, I think when we've discussed what sort of stands out is definitely the ground escorted patients in terms of the mortality rate. I don't know, it seems a little bit surprising that they are have such a high mortality rate. I guess the cohort of the broad range of patients that they're seeing, this is not just a trauma base of patients, this is medical patients with a broad age range and a broad range of comorbidities. And I think, it's likely, I suppose, if we think about those patients that are not necessarily going to be transported in an ambulance, in an air ambulance, but potentially because of their comorbidities may have a high mortality rate. They potentially, if it's a heart attack or stroke, I don't know. I was wondering what everyone else's thoughts on that would be, in terms of why that seems quite high in comparison to the airlifted patient. Sort of in my head, I would sort of assume that they would be the sickest and have the highest mortality rate.
I can't see I don't have the people's faces on the screen right now because I'm recording this, but if there's anyone else who wants to jump in, I'm not sure. Max is texting. I'm not sure if he's able to speak because he's he's doing other stuff. Let me just see what he says.
Okay.
Hi, it's Tom.
There you go. Oh, there's Tom. Yeah.
Hi, Tom.
Thanks very much. I guess it underlines for me the difficulty with interpreting papers from other systems where there are, a huge number of things we don't understand, so if they are risk averse about flying patients who are unstable, then that could account for it. Or if they have a trauma system where they're flying mainly, young patients with isolated head injuries, long distances for neurosurgery, versus ground escorting, shocked or penetrating trauma patients somewhere for damage control first, that might account for it. So I guess, and I'm sorry, I haven't had time to sort of fully read the paper, but I guess those sorts of system factors may have a big impact. And I think that's quite common in pre-hospital care research.
Yeah, and I think similar to that, what I think, and you probably missed at the very beginning, Tom, sort of a bit of Rachel's introduction, but they're a broad critical care service, and the vast majority of of the patients they look after are medical with very little trauma. So I think the other thing that Rachel and I discussed depends on, as you said, not knowing about their system, how their stroke system works, how their PCI system works. Do they have a lot of local accessibility for things like acute STEMI management, but only a certain number of patients have to go the long distances? The other thing that you pointed out about this, Rachel, which is really interesting, and the thing that they really emphasized in the introduction as to why they were doing this study in the first place, because they really wanted to look at the safety of their system, particularly around the patients where they assist on scene or where they're canceled, and to look at the mortality of them. And the mortality amongst certainly the 1 day mortality of the aborted patients, so the ones where they're canceled by other people on scene, is the lowest of all their mortalities. and it's significantly different than the others. But it was interesting to note that as you start to get up to the 1 year, the mortality in that group does actually go up, which is not surprising. But for the assisted patients, the ones that they leave on scene, the 30-day mortality for them is still lower, but not, and for both the assisted, the 1 day and the 30-day mortality is not all that different from their airlifted patients, which is kind of interesting that you'd think that typically the airlifted was going to be their sickest of the sick going to the tertiary care hospital, but they end up in the, they're not all that dissimilar from the assisted. So as you said, a lot of it probably has to do with understanding the system more than anything. And it probably made more sense to them with that understanding than it does to us.
Yeah, so if I said this right, Kaplan-Meier cumulative mortality curves. I guess this is just showing again that information and showing the ground escorted patients have this higher mortality rate. And again, we just are not able to really sort of find out more information about those patients. Should we move on to the next slide? Yeah, so table 4 is going through which hospitals these patients were taken to, whether there was any sort of secondary transfer, and then what happened to that patient. So specifically their outcomes were the admittance to ICU, mechanical ventilation, and their length of stay in hospital. And they sort of very broadly summarised whether or not they had trauma or a cardiovascular neuro problem or other diagnostics. So it's they're quite broad groups, these. And I think in terms of what was quite interesting in these figures, so in terms of, they seem to be taking people to the right hospital. There's a very low rate of secondary transfers, but there are still secondary transfers that have occurred in those assisted patients, aborted patients. And again, it's a question of whether or not, are they able to drill down? Is this a potential future study to identify why those patient cohorts were then transferred? And the challenges, especially with the aborted mission patients, is that they don't have the record, they don't have the patient information, so they don't have the unique identifiers. They're not able to do the follow-up on those patients. So that there is a sort of question mark on that group. And in terms of admittance to ICU as well, there's a reasonably high number in the assisted patients who have gone to ICU and ended up being ventilated. And I guess it's just, we can't really answer that question of what's happened to those patients, but I think given that they can't find out what's happened to those aborted missions currently, that's probably the next sort of patients that they should look into in terms of safety, and what was that patient journey and what happened for them to end up getting admitted and mechanically ventilated. And again, this is just supporting that they're taking the critically injured, the time critical patients to the right location, these university hospitals, which are your one-stop shop for everything. And it's about understanding that system and what they have available in the DGNs as well. But I thought it was quite impressively low that they're in terms of transfers. Is there anything else on that, Mike, that you want to add?
Oh, I think that covers the the key points, just the distribution of the trauma and their low secondary transfer rate, which was good to see.
Yeah. Should we go to the next one? Okay, so I suppose this is, do we trust the results and how accurate they are? So I think for when we look at the validated sources they've got their data from, and how comprehensive and the information they're able to find, I think it can be relied upon, this information. I guess we just come back to this aborted missions group, is that there's just no information. So it's a lot, it's 12% of this data set that can't be used, or we don't know what's happened. So potentially that 12% could change the figures, or in some areas, and I guess that's something that they've raised that they need to look at. Next one. And I've said yes this for very similar reasons, is that they have used for their sort of dead or alive reporting, they've used reliable source of information, and the fact that they've got this national patient register with unique identifiers that we can, from these sort of the information they've pulled from the system and the outcomes, it's a reliable, it appears to be a very reliable study. And as Mike's already said, their cohort, their patient base is broadly medical. It's a very small amount. So in terms of looking at our patient distribution, probably it's not going to work that well for us to sort of compare ourselves to this system. But what we would, I think, is really exciting about this paper, and actually what we really need to do is look at how we can get this information, and with the potential, I think we can move on from this slide, is that we, and again with this, is that we don't have the same setup in the UK in terms of air ambulance, having this shared information, and also for us to have information on outcomes of patients from going up to a year in our database. And I guess it's pushing us hopefully with the inception of EPCR, and what we could do in the future, and what information we could get, potentially nationally, if we're all working on a similar system, and be able to say that we're safe, and what the outcomes of our patients are, and that's got to be beneficial, hopefully, in a charity environment as well, that we have greater evidence that we're doing the right thing for our patients, and the longer term outcomes. And if anyone wants to do some dispatch research, Mike wants you to come and do it. I don't know, Mike, in terms of like EPCR and our HEMS database, is there sort of any sort of discussions about this kind of information and how we get it from the system in the future?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, somehow got to your wrong slide. I'll get to the end.
That's right. That's the end.
Oh, it was the end. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me stop. So I think I think a couple of things. So EPCR holds some potential for us in that we'll actually hopefully have a little bit better quality of data capture, and just the issues around it, that it has data validation and a bunch of other things in it, that it is generated from will be generated eventually from the CAD. So we get that whole sort of follow through bit. It is linked to the NHS spine. So it offers us the potential of starting to get some NHS numbers on more patients. And with that, then we can use that unique identifier to start to link into things like TARN and other data sets. The rate of capture for those is still going to be at the moment lower in trauma patients because, in terms of the upfront capture, because, as you know, a lot of our patients aren't telling us their date of birth and their name and their address on scene, which is necessary to do the linking. But down the road, sort of in the next phase of this, once the whole One London project comes on and there's sort of two-way data exchange from this, there should be a better opportunity to get data back from hospitals for the patients that have been dropped off through the One London system, connect up the records, and then the hospitals often either generate a new NHS number for the patient if they remain unidentified or don't have NHS, or we can link back to their NHS number, and that will be the record that's associated anyways with their hospital episode in the TARN database and in the NHS database. So I think over time we'll get there, but it is pretty impressive that the Danes have managed to get all but 12% of their patients identified and linked to their national database is a hugely rich resource to have. And I think the thing for us, and as we mentioned at the beginning, the more important thing about this is just that it's a good example of the way we need to ask and answer questions around dispatch, that some of the short-term things like what happened to the team what did the team do when they got there is some information, but really linking to longer-term outcomes is what's really needed to start to get a good sense of the decision-making around patients that we go to, we ground assist, we triage, are we being tasked to the right patients in the first place, and being able to capture things like secondary transfer, like how many of the patients that we ground assist end up going to a trauma center afterwards. That would be something to be very informative to us and a good benchmark or quality indicator to say how often that happens, because if it does happen a lot, we probably should have taken them in the first place. That would be helpful to know and at least monitor over time. Sure. So so anybody, Harriet, Tom, Christine, thanks for joining. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Any other comments or thoughts on this?
I think you're absolutely right, Mike. This is the sort of stuff we need to be aspiring to, isn't it? So that, and hopefully once we get the tech side working well, no one should underestimate it, but it should all be possible. And we should be able to say with confidence that we're going to the right patients and we understand, how long patients that we treat are surviving for, and, that people aren't getting secondary transfers when we ground assist them and those sorts of things. And they're important quality metrics that we need at the sort of foundation of our quality service, as much as we need the kind of Zone 1 Reboa patients getting super nuanced follow-up. We need to know system-wide what's happening as well. Yeah, good.
Harriet, certainly in KSS, you do a lot of work and they have HEMS based there, which means you're working well, but what success do you have there with follow-up? And I don't know if you have any sense from the work you're doing with the blood study, sort of the current challenges or opportunities with follow-up of patients in our system.
I think it's exactly the same challenges across both, is that it's the lack of a common data set, and it relies sort of on anecdotal people working. If you have a colleague working in a TU and a colleague working with MTC goes, oh, that patient who got transferred up the other day. It's something we're working on definitely with KSS in that terms of what is our secondary transfer rate. And at the moment we can only do it by the same as you guys do in terms of just ringing up every patient we follow up and see what happened, especially for the ground assist, because I think everyone gets a bit distracted by the big jobs you're taking into MTC, but arguably it's more important to follow up those we ground assisted. And, was your primary survey, was your initial assessment correct? Or did you miss something that subsequently needed a secondary transfer? And again, it's working with CCAM or with LAS to provide an overview of a data set, but that's still ongoing work. And again, I think the same as with the whole blood, it again relies a lot on colleagues and connections, which is fine in the short term, but not particularly resilient in the long term, and capturing a sort of a regional overview, let alone a national overview like the Danes have done.
Thanks. Christine, did you have any great thoughts from the data side and the work you've done elsewhere with linkages and things of data? Hope you're on mute still.
Perhaps trivial point is that I was struck by, in a very different system, the similarity of cancelled jobs percentages. It's about 35%. We know from the LAS data for LAA, it's about 35%, jobs that were sent on but didn't get to in this. And so, in what are presumably very different dispatch criteria, or quite different dispatch criteria, quite different, times to launch the aircraft, whatever. So I guess I just started thinking, what else is out there? What is the sort of ideal number, as it were, of cancelled jobs? Because there are always going to be some that HEMS is sent to and then it is not making it all the way to.
Yes, good point. It's nice to have fresh set of eyes on some of these things to see that kind of stuff. Thanks, Rachel. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this, or how did you find the whole experience and process? Can you do a little advertisement for more paramedics doing critical appraisal, and it wasn't terribly scary or anything?
I don't know. I hate doing presentations, so I'm doing something massively outside of my comfort zone. So it's good on that perspective. It's actually it's really good actually to do this, and I think I'd quite like to do it again. Actually, I would definitely. It's a good opportunity, one, to sort of talk with you and sort of go through this paper, and it gets you thinking a bit differently about things. And audit and research is actually an interesting area that there's so much potential in it, and it was good. I quite enjoyed it actually. Not the presenting bit, but yeah, it's good. It's interesting actually. Yeah.
Well, thanks. We really appreciate you doing it, and spread the word. Try and recruit more people down the road, and that would be great. Okay. Cool. Any other last final words from anybody? Okay, well, thanks for taking the time to make it. And like I said, we have good viewership from the team on YouTube, so we get hopefully you'll get more comments and discussion spread that way, Rachel, and they'll be asking for your autograph soon and stuff. So it's okay. All right.
I don't know. I think this could be my final performance.
And unfortunately, we have no monetization because it's all unlisted links, so I can't promise you any money for it. But
it's all good.
Just our
Thanks so much.
Dying gratitude. All
Thanks,
right,
everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.